Welcome, everybody. My name is Sam. I'm the membership manager at Jewish Voice for Peace, and I am so excited that we are doing this tonight. Tali, my colleague who's over in Berkeley right now, has been working really hard to put this together, as have I, and we're really honored to have Gary Burge and Don Wagner here with us tonight to talk about Christian Zionism, which is a topic that our members and our staff have been pushing to have more discussions about and more education about for a long time. So we're really excited. So I just want to give a brief introduction to our speakers, and then I will hand it over to them. So I'm going to start with Don Wagner. Reverend Dr. Don Wagner retired last year as National Program Director of Friends of Sabeel North America and remains involved with its Theology Committee. Previously, he was Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at North Park University in Chicago, where he also directed the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. He has written or co-edited 5 books, including Zionism and the Quest for Justice in the Holy Land, Dying in the Land of Promise, Palestine and Palestinian Christianity, Peace or Armageddon, Anxious for Armageddon, and All in the Name of the Bible. He's married to Linda Khatib and has 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Don and Linda are active for justice in Palestine and in the Chicago area. So thank you so much for being with us, Don. And then let me find Gary and make you big while I introduce you. Gary Burge, PhD, is a professor of New Testament at Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Gary has authored a number of books, including commentaries on John and the letters of John. He also specializes in the Middle East, its churches, and its history in the Greek and Roman periods. His book, Whose Land, Whose Promise, received recognition from national journals. This was followed by Jesus in the Land, a theological study of the land promises in the New Testament. Recently, he co-authored a college textbook entitled The New Testament in Antiquity. His most recent titles are Theological Questions Everyone Asks, A Week in the Life of a Centurion, Mapping Our Academic Careers, and The New Testament in 7 Sentences, a digest of New Testament theology. So thank you very much, Gary, for being with us.
Thanks for having us, Sam.
Yeah, of course. And just to say again, we've gotten about 100 new folks while I was just making those introductions. So thank you all for being here. This was one of the most, if not the most, registrants we've ever had on a webinar that we've put on. So clearly there is a ton of interest in this topic. And if by the end of tonight we're left with 1 million questions that we didn't get to, and 1 million things we want to dive into that we didn't have time for, I think it's pretty clear that we're going to have to put on a few more of these types of webinars on this topic. So, so we'll look forward to that. All right. So I just want to dive right in. So starting with you, Gary, if I'm not mistaken, to just sort of bring us through some of the very basic definitions of Christian Zionism. And I will pull up the presentation while you do so.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Samantha, for hosting this. And Don, it's great to do this with you as well. And I just would like to welcome personally all of you who have joined us today or this evening, depending on where you are, because I think that this is indeed a really, really significant issue. It'll show up in synagogues, it'll show up in churches, and it's something where you can be taken by surprise. Just the other day, I had a student of mine at the seminary who's from Ireland. He went home for Christmas, was saw one of his friends, and within 5 minutes, his friend said, "By the way, I hope you know that Israel is fulfilling prophecy, and if you don't support the state of Israel as a Christian, it's clear that you don't understand the Bible, and possibly your own salvation is in jeopardy." Anyway, that's kind of a surprising report he brought back to us, but it just underscores this notion that what we have in Christian Zionism is a very, very broadly understood a teaching that is everywhere inside of the church. So I'm not going to address directly political issues in Israel and Palestine necessarily, unless those do come up. I'm not a specialist in Jewish Zionism, but I do know about Christian Zionism, and that's what I think my task will be today, so that I can help you understand it. So the first thing that I want to say is that Christian Zionism, it is a political theology. And this would not be the first time that the church has been engaged in some kind of political theology. And by that, this is what I mean. I mean that we have times in history where the church has said that its own theology, its own creed system, it can actually endorse the political status of the state in which it lives or some other status of another state elsewhere. So you can see this beginning, say, in the Byzantine Empire almost 1700 years ago, where somehow the church felt obligated to say, God is doing his work inside of this political state that we have here. So therefore, I think it's fair to say that first, it's a political theology, and it's a synthesis of a certain political ideology and religion. That's the first thing. Samantha, I'm wondering if we can, shall I tip you off when we need to scroll down? What's the best way for me to do that?
Yeah, go ahead and just say next slide or keep.
Okay, all right, go to my first slide that says Christian Zionism, just across the top of it there. Yeah, there we go. That's what I'm thinking about right there. So the first thing is that this is a political theology, and what it does is synthesizes a view of politics, in this case, the Middle East, and a religious system. Now, the outgrowth of this sort of Christian Zionism is really, I would call it a divine endorsement for modern Israel. So therefore, it is as a theological system that comes out of the Bible that I'll explain to you in a minute, but its application is here in the 20th or 21st century, trying to say that because of a way of reading the Bible, it's possible for me to move into the Middle East and make an endorsement on one particular country, namely the state of Israel. Now, throughout the history of the church, whenever the church has endorsed one political ideology, we have always lived to regret it. And for many of us inside of the church, we look at Christian Zionism and we are convinced that this is also something that we will deeply regret, probably in 50 or so years. All right, let's go to the next slide. And what I want to do is make clear that what this theological system looks like. It's been around for quite a few decades. It has been around, especially in a focused way, for the last 100 years. It's difficult to get an outline of what Christian Zionists believe. It is almost an informal coalition. It is almost driven by laity. It is an instinctive position that people feel that they have to have if they are faithful to the Bible. So after having read a lot of the writings of people who are really Christian Zionists, I think I'm able to distill this into 6 commitments. So if you would go to the next slide for me, these are the 6 commitments, and I'm just going to walk through them one at a time with you, and you can see what they are. The first of all, you'll have a sense that among many Christian Zionists, not all, but most, there is this intuition that we've come to the end of history. It's driven by what we call an eschatology, which is a theology surrounded by feelings about the end time. So it would be common to hear pastors preaching sermons about how everything, all of the catastrophes from war to environmental collapse, all of these things are predicted inside of the Hebrew Bible especially. And we right now are living in the final countdown of the very end of time. So they have this sense of imminent catastrophe, you might think, but for them it's kind of exciting, and I'll tell you why it's exciting when I get to step 6. Now, how do I know that countdown really began? Well, the first commitment says that when Israel was born in 1948, this marked the final generation. So there are many who would say because Israel is the last puzzle piece that has been on the board, and now I am just looking for the other puzzle pieces to complete the final picture. So the first thing is you have a sense of imminent sort of collapse to history. Second idea is that, this is the next slide, is that you shouldn't despair. You shouldn't despair when you look at the Middle East and the Middle East seems to be falling apart in war, or you look at the environment and everything's terrible, because God has a master plan. God is actually unfolding something before our eyes. And you can see this even in the quote that I've placed on the screen here from David Breckner. Peril awaits those who presume to say that God is finished with his chosen people. Just as God judged the nation of Egypt for her ill treatment of his people, so he will judge the nations today. Evangelicals who would understand the Middle East today must pay close attention to the teaching of Scripture. They must choose carefully what side to uphold. So, okay, so the world is falling apart, step one. Step two is God has a plan. It's all unfolding. You had better get on board with God's plan. And at the very center of God's plan is the modern state of Israel. The third step in this sort of worldview, which you'll hear among Christian Zionists, is that God has made promises. And if you want to understand his plan, you need to go back into the Hebrew Bible and you need to read these promises. God has promised the Holy Land to the Jewish people. God's character is eternal. His personhood does not change. And therefore, promises he made to Abraham back in the book of Genesis now are secured today for the modern state of Israel. So therefore, they will frequently quote from, say, Genesis 15:8, which you can see on your screen. This is the promise of land to Abraham. And they believe, well, you have to hold on to these promises. If you have these promises, you know what the plan is. And if you know what the plan is, you are not rattled by how history seems to be unfolding. All right. The fourth step in this sort of framework for Christian Zionists is all about prophecy. Because what they believe is that the modern state of Israel is not just an ordinary state like any other state in the world. There is a kind of, I would call it, divine exceptionalism inside of Israel. In other words, the things Israel does politically, be it 1948 and that war, 1967, these things can be locked into some portion of the Hebrew Bible. And therefore, it's common to see Israeli tour guides taking American evangelical pastors around Israel and saying, look at this, look at that. These are all the fulfillment of prophecy. Here I've placed on the screen some books that you may or may not have heard of. John Hagee's book, Jerusalem Countdown and Beginning of the End. John Hagee is probably one of the most widely read popularizers of all of the thinking that I'm giving to you right now. To be clear, John Hagee would never claim to be a scholar, and I don't think a scholar would ever claim him for their own. But what he does is he popularizes this. And at the very beginning, I mean, it is really scary stuff until you get on the plan, okay? So prophecy is the fourth step. The fifth step is if you're going to stand rightly in relationship to God and his plan and his promises, then it is necessary for you to bless Israel. Now, it's very important that we're clear about what is being said here. This is not that you are sympathetic with Israel's political position in the Middle East. This is not that you feel grief, as you should, for what happened in the Holocaust and Israel is going to make that right. This is not a historical or political perspective. This is a theological perspective. For them, Israel, blessing Israel, is a theological test for you standing rightly with God in what he is doing in history. Here you can see on the screen a quote from Greg Laurie, who is one of these preachers in Riverside, California, in a very large secret church. He says, there's almost global hatred of Israel, but God made a promise long ago to Abraham and his descendants. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. America has blessed Israel by supporting her right to exist and sending billions of dollars of much-needed support her way over the years. Now, what Christian Zionists will do is they will take a verse like this, Genesis 12:3, they will lift it out of its context and they will place it in the 21st century and say this promise of blessing and curse applies not just to Abraham, but it applies to the secular state of Israel that you see today. So if you want to have, now this is how this gets complicated, if you want to have a life of blessing, if you want to have a country that is blessed and will prosper economically or in any way, you need to stand with Israel, bless Israel, send Israel money. At Calvin Seminary, we are a very international campus. We have 22, I think 23 countries represented in our student body. And so I'm teaching a class on this right now. And in my class, I have about 6 students from 3 different continents. And as we talk about this, they say to me, there are people all over the world who believe in their poverty that if they bless Israel and send Israel money, they will financially benefit from it. It's a remarkable idea. It is a wedding of Christian Zionism with the prosperity gospel that is very well known in Latin America and Africa today. Okay, so I see what's happening here. The world's falling apart. Don't worry, God has a plan. You have to understand his promises. You have to read his prophecies correctly. You have to bless Israel, and then you are going to be on the winning side of this equation. Now, you would think that this is all about a love for Israel. This is all about a love for Judaism. But one of the really deep mysteries that my Jewish friends always mention to me is that the game plan isn't actually seeing Judaism or Israel as the end of the road, because this is all, you might say, a prelude to the great climactic event, step 6, and that is the second coming of Christ. Now, you may know or may not that inside of some Christian eschatologies, there's this understanding that history comes to a climax, history comes to its denouement at the very end of time with catastrophic war, with demise of nations, and then Christ returns, he inaugurates the judgment day. Now, if that's the case, what happens then is Christian Zionists have said, well, if history is unfolding as God has wanted it, if prophecy is being fulfilled, that means the second coming of Christ is imminent. So for many of them, their passion is not necessarily rescuing Israel as much. It is how Israel becomes almost a football in a larger game. And the game is to see the end of time and God's blessing. Now, the next slide is going to show you what I call the old Christian Zionism. If you look at this very carefully, it'll take a minute for me just to explain some of these pieces here. But when I put this on the screen and I am in front of a large group of evangelicals, every single one of them will recognize every element. So if you see, this is a timeline which stretches across from the birth of Israel until the end of time, actually. But notice that the timeline begins with the birth of Israel in 1948. And then what happens is that these teachers reach into the Old Testament, especially the book of Daniel and Ezekiel. And what they say is, well, just before the great end of human history as we know it, when Christ returns, there will be 7 years of terrible warfare. But we as Christians will be exempt from that warfare because the rapture will happen. That means that God is going to call all of his Christians, his true Christians, to actually literally leave the earth and await for the unfolding of history with God in heaven. So the church is going to exit the scene, 7 years of tribulation, a terrible war is going to erupt, Christ returns, inaugurates the judgment, you can see it on the screen, and that will then begin 1,000 years of Christ's rule. That's mentioned in the book of Revelation. Now, this framework that I've laid out here for you has been taught in American fundamentalist churches probably for 100 years. If you go back to 1875, 1850, 1800, go back before the 19th century. You're not going to find this at all. So this is a kind of sort of a theological schema to help us understand how history is going to be played out. And today, where are we? We, for many of them, they would say, we are very, very close to the rapture of the church. And so therefore, you might think we're looking with excitement about the possibility of catastrophic war inside of the Middle East. Why? Because you can see here on the timeline, that is going to be a prelude to the second coming of Christ. Let me go to the next slide. So that is what I call the old Christian Zionism, which is very much tied to eschatology. But this is what is called today the new Christian Zionism. And you can see here that this is a book that I have on the screen. There are only about 2 or 3 books that actually work with this. The new Christian Zionism is less driven by eschatology, and it is more driven by what I'll call covenant theology. I'll explain that to you. The new Christian Zionism recognized that timeline and those steps and everything, they just don't work theologically. And so there are scholars, this is more of a scholar-driven enterprise. They've said, what we need to understand is God's ongoing relationship with Judaism, and by extension, Judaism's Israel in the Middle East. So go to the next slide, and I'll show you how this goes. There has always been inside of the church a teaching that there is no ongoing relationship that God has with the Jewish people. This is supersessionism. This is called replacement theology. And you can see the Abraham's covenant is this gray arrow here. I break it off to show that Judaism really lives without Christ, and therefore it is going to be judged. There's a new covenant here in purple. We'll call it the Messianic covenant community, if you wish. But the key here is discontinuity. This is terrible teaching, and we have rejected it soundly throughout the last, 150 years. But go to the next slide. This will be my last, and you will see what has happened with the New Christian Zionism. In the New Christian Zionism, there's a form of teaching that says, okay, God made a covenant with Abraham, and then with the coming of Christ, these covenants God has made with Israel have not been made obsolete. Now, this is the key. That creates what a Christian theologian would call a two-covenant theology. So therefore, you might see in purple, there's a Messianic covenant, that is to say the church, which now lives alongside Judaism's covenant with Abraham. So I say here, Judaism without Christ. So you have two covenants running side by side. Now, here's the key. If the covenant of Abraham has not been affected by the coming of Messiah, then the promises that come with the covenant of Abraham are still in play. That means for these new Christian Zionists, what they want to say is, if the covenant of Abraham is still in play, then the promises of land to the modern state of Israel are sound. So you can see here you have a theological covenant theology spilling into a political affirmation in the Middle East. I hope that's helpful to you. I know it took a little longer than I'd hoped, but these are complicated things, Samantha, and it's hard to do in a very short order. Don?
No, thank you. I think all of this is so incredibly fascinating, and I think this will warrant its own independent webinar to dive into these different theologies. So thank you. So now, Dawn, I'm hoping that you can take us through the next step, which is a bit about the history of Christian Zionism, and then we're going to wind up talking about Christian Zionism today and Christians United for Israel, which is a group that I think many people are familiar with. And just wanted to let people know that at the top of your screen, I believe, maybe Tully, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you should be able to still access the chat box while we're doing these presentations. If you go to the top of your screen, you should still see maybe like 3 dots where it says more. If you click on that, you can see chat as an option, but maybe it looks different on my screen. So I just wanted to double check.
Okay.
Great. Go ahead, Gary. Don, excuse me.
Okay, I'll take it away. Gary, thanks. Great overview. It's stimulating a lot of responses, I can see. Well, thank you for having us. Thank you, JVP. And I will try to give you a book within 10 minutes here of this long and complicated history. You see that this theology, the premillennial theology of Jesus coming before the end of history, this has been around in the fringes of Christianity, but was never recognized as orthodox. It's been there from the first century. And it developed around millennial periods, like around, say, 1800. There was an explosion of millennial thinking, and people cast around, and they developed a lot of it. When I did my doctoral research, I went to the British Museum and was able to find one monograph dated 1585 calling for the Jews to return to Israel. And they mentioned Palestine at the time. I opened another volume, 1621. So this was around that period of the 1600. There's a great lot of millennial explosion and great interest in the end times. So if you move to the next one, Samantha. So when the Pilgrims came, this was in the air. And when John Winthrop preached a sermon of departure, he used a text from 2 Samuel 7, I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. So when some of the pilgrims and people like Winthrop came, they saw themselves as like the new Israel, bringing Christianity and you might say colonialism, to the native people and to the new world. So there's a couple things tied in here. There's this thing of the new Israel, of colonialism, and this is a settler colonialism, as it was seen, where we not only take the resources, but we replace people, ghettoize them, and so on. So there's a link here that I'll just mention with settler colonial projects. Next slide. The person that really systematized some of these beliefs was John Nelson Darby. You see him there, his dates 1800, 1882. And he put together dispensationalism, which are Gary referred to it, which are the different periods of history by which God will judge people. So he assembled all this, and in it, he highlighted, of course, the rapture, which Gary just mentioned. I grew up believing this stuff. It's a real fear-based theology for little kids, and I bought into it. The tribulation, which was this long period of the wars, and then this will prepare for Jesus coming. But conveniently, the born-again Christians will be raptured and removed and won't have to go through that period. Darby brought this to the United States in 5 missionary tours, and he became a very popular teacher in the Bible and conference movements, prophecy movements, and influenced people like Dwight Moody, William E. Blackstone, and go to the next slide, we'll see a little bit of Blackstone. Some people define Christian Zionism as the political end-time theology that supports Zionism. And some differentiate that there should be a political component. Others say the belief system leads one to be a Christian Zionist. So we have to use our definitions carefully. But I'm more inclined to say that when it becomes political with this type of theology, this is really a key component of what Christian Zionism has become. He wrote his bestseller in 1878, after the Civil War, Jesus is Coming. And it was a bestseller. It was like a New York Times bestseller before they had that. It's been translated in over 20 languages. He had a massive influence on Dwight L. Moody and many others. He proposed a presidential petition to President Harrison in 1891 and 1892. This was a call for the Jews to have a state of their own because of the pogroms. The Jewish suffering led him to this kind of a position. It was financed by the Rockefeller family. It was in papers from Boston to New York, across to the Mississippi, St. Louis, and so on. And he had the first political program that you might say would be a Christian lobby for Israel. And you note that is before Herzl founded the first Zionist Congress, 1897. So some argue Christian Zionism predates modern political Jewish Zionism by a few years. Some will even go back to Lord Shaftesbury in 1839, 1840, calling for the Jews to return to Israel. He was named by Justice Brandeis the father of Zionism because he was so influential and paved the way so well. Okay, next slide. We're going to jump up to the present a little bit more. Jerry Falwell, Christian Zionism and fundamentalism went into abeyance for a long period of time. But as Gary said, it really resurrects with the creation of Israel in 48. And Falwell really put it together as a political program with his moral majority. Jerry Falwell would say, he used Genesis 12:3, which Gary referred to earlier. Those who bless Israel will be blessed. The nation will thrive, and we as America must honor Israel with their financial and political support. But if we become a little bit critical of Israel, God will judge us and we will decline. So you see how they take a verse out of context and put a political and theological spin on it at the same time. Then go over across the screen. There's Reagan with Shamir. Ronald Reagan was converted to these beliefs when he was governor of California. And he believed in this end-time theology. It wasn't quite refined in a systematic way, but he bought into it. And Reagan convened annual seminars with the religious right in the White House. And he would have such people as the Israeli ambassador speak to the group. Oliver North was one of his favorite leaders during that period. So Reagan really sponsored and helped this movement grow. Next slide. But where it really takes off, we need to get the one with Mr. Trump and Pence. Is that before this one? There we are. Bring us right into the present moment. Mike Pence is a dyed-in-the-wool Christian Zionist. If we had time, I would play you one of his speeches at Christians United for Israel, where he really is calling for massive support of Israel, and Christians United for Israel hosted him. And this is the major organization now that is really sponsoring political Christian Zionism. They claim to have over 4 million members. I don't know what that means, but they claim 4 million. They have annual conventions, so they have people like Netanyahu or Pence speak to them. And they declared 1917 the year that they would lobby to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. And they were very successful. Pence was visited by Hagee and many others, as was Trump, to push them on moving the embassy, and indeed they did. So this is part of the base of Trump's support. And jump to the next slide. You see, this is a key component where Trump usually has a base of about 81% of evangelicals. And evangelicals are a larger umbrella. And a lot of the people Gary has at Calvin Seminary are not Christian Zionists. Not all evangelicals are Christian Zionists. It's a subset. You might say about 20%. But they are strongly motivated and politicized. So there we have it right up to Christians United for Israel to give you a sense of where this is and a little bit of the broad numbers and some of their political beliefs. So why don't we move from that then, Samantha and Gary, to maybe the next section.
Would you like to show that clip?
Yeah.
Okay, let me just.
We have time?
Yeah, I think we have time. Let me get it shared up on the screen. Hang on one second.
Better to give a true Christian Zionist rather than us. Give this feel.
All right. Can you all see it?
Yeah, this guy kind of introduces Pence.
Premier gathering of pro-Israel activists, and this year they got a special treat. Vice President Mike Pence delivered a...
Oh, it didn't work.
Look.
Keeps the promises he makes to his people and to each one of us. The Jewish people had turned the desert into a garden, sickness into health, scarcity into plenty, despair into hope, and slander into blessing, rebuking all who condemn them, not for what they do wrong, but for what they do right. And under President Donald Trump, if the world knows nothing else, the world will know this: America stands with Israel, now and always.
Okay, that might be
I
enough.
had the privilege of emceeing the Washington summit.
Yeah, so there you have it. The world stands with Israel, and the United States stands with Israel. Well, we must lead the way. So we will be blessed as a nation so long as we stand with Israel, economically, politically, and so on. So Christians United for Israel is a powerful force. They have either offices or a presence in every state in the Union, and they can mobilize a significant number. The person that really ran the operation until recently was David Bragg, who came straight out of AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby, and he really put them on the map. Hagee is the figurehead and was the chair and is still on the board. But he is the one, as Gary says, who writes and popularizes the movement. Okay, let's move on. Okay, I think you can go down one. Well, Gary, we can bounce this back and forth. There are a number of critics within Christianity, and one of them is Walter Brueggemann, who may be the foremost Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar in the country. And he's recently written a book called Chosen. He has shifted his position in the last 5 years, I would say. And here he says, it's not for Christian readers of the Bible to reduce the Bible to an ideological prop for the state of Israel, as though support for Israel were a final outcome of biblical testimony. So there you go, right away with a strong critique. And he goes on to differentiate. He say the Israel that's in the Bible is not the modern state of Israel. And a lot of Christian Zionists, as I grew up in that movement, we equate it with the modern state of Israel. What's in the Bible is Israel, and that's the modern state that fulfills the Bible prophecy. Maybe go down to the next slide. There is a lot more. And Gary, why don't you comment on this?
Yeah, and Don, if I can just add something about Brueggemann. One of the things that's interesting about Walter Brueggemann is that he is a scholar who really works in the Hebrew prophets. That's his specialty. And therefore, as an extension of that, he feels that the genius of the Hebrew prophets is that they were not simply making privileged claims for the people of Israel, but they were actually giving, you might say, ethical exhortations. And so Brueggemann's whole career, his whole life, if you hear him preach in a church someday, if you ever hear him speaking in your town, go hear him. He's a amazing guy. But for him, his whole consciousness has been shaped by the Hebrew prophets. Therefore, when he comes upon some moral issue, be it race in America or economic inequality or the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, you can just see it just triggers everything. The man sounds like Isaiah to me. So that's why he becomes an outspoken prophet himself in the 21st century for a number of moral issues.
Okay, you'll see on the screen there's a couple other issues that Brueggemann and others point to. Brueggemann notes, and he gets into simplifies text criticism, where you look at the different texts critically. And he says there are at least two major narratives in the Bible. The more tribal text is there. Israel gets the land. The Abrahamic, he calls it the Abrahamic tribal position. And you see it in books like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, and so on. But he says there's another narrative in the Bible that triumphs in the prophets. And he says that's a Mosaic narrative. And you can see it woven in different places. And he says within the Mosaic narrative, there are sections where it's clear the land can be lost. And I have one highlighted here, Leviticus 18, where the text says, the land itself will vomit you out. And the implication there is if you do not honor the covenant, if you fall into idolatry, you can lose the land. So that is there as a critique. So the Bible kind of critiques itself in a way. And he says that the land is given conditionally, and the condition is obedience. So here he's shown this other narrative in the Bible that kind of critiques some of the more tribal positions that you see very clearly. Gary, you wanted to jump in there.
No, I think that's great. You're fine.
Okay. Just a couple other things. Chosenness. Chosenness is not, as he sees it, an exclusive claim only for Jews and only, to have like domain over the land and whatever. And that is in Ezra, Nehemiah, Genesis 12:3, which we just said. So he says, but there's a more inclusive frame where the chosen people are open to others being honored by God. And you see that in Psalm 87 in the book of Jonah. So in a way, you can find in the prophets, particularly in some of these other books, in certain selected Psalms, but most of the Psalms are pretty violent and, not so inclusive. But you see another narrative is what I want to say. And finally, I want to say that the whole issue of the covenant implies that God is the one who gives the covenant. And the condition of the covenant is that we honor God and submit before God. And then the Torah is given by which we obey and follow God. But I think in many ways, Christian Zionism and in a way Zionism invert that covenant. And it worships either the land or the nation state. So it flips that covenant responsibility on its head and inverts it and falls into idolatry. So those are just a few comments I'd like to add in terms of, the critique within Scripture. I want to also say that Brant Rosen has written a marvelous article. He's a close friend, but boy, someone I just really looked up to that I really want to recommend, where he looks at some of these narratives and just begins to critique the whole thing of exceptionalism as a serious problem with modern Zionism and what it has led us to in terms of its nationalism and settler colonialism, apartheid, and so on. So I'll stop there.
Don, one of the things I think that Brueggemann and many biblical scholars have pointed out to us is that inside of the Abrahamic promise in Genesis 12, there are three features. Two of the features have always been championed throughout Israel's history, but there's the third feature that was more or less ignored. Brueggemann says, well, the first aspect of the promise to Abraham is that he would have many children, yes. Second is that he would have this land of Canaan. And then the third is that the nations of the world would be blessed through Israel. And what's interesting is that in Jewish theological discourse that precedes the sort of the Christian era and just after the Christian era, the first two were given a great deal of attention because one ethnicity for one land is the dream of, well, virtually every people in the earth, but, especially for Israel. But this idea of how it is that you're going to be a blessing to the nations is a feature that the New Testament develops very carefully. Because the aim of Israel's national life in the world is not simply the restoration of a sort of a tribal empire, you might say, inside of the Middle East. It is an attempt to bring restoration to the entire world. That's the idea. So there is a kind of global, you might say, a worldwide sort of messianic mission out there. So when religion, you could put it this way, you could just hear Brueggemann saying this, when religion is used in the interest of privilege and exceptionalism, you know that it is moving away from the interests of God and moving into an arena of sin. When, on the other hand, your religion is used as a platform for service, for those who are your neighbor and those who are strangers to you, and as the New Testament says, even those who are your enemy. If your religion becomes a platform for loving those who are not loveworthy, then you're moving into the interests of God and away from the arena of sin. That would be a very Brueggemann-esque way to sort of look at this entire issue.
Yeah, let me add one other thing here. before maybe we go to questions, and that is there's different types of Christian Zionism. Gary mentioned two.
Right.
You know, I would call it the fundamentalist subset of evangelicalism. You know, it's a type of fundamentalism. And it's not a literal reading of the Bible. It's a selective literalism where it lifts certain texts out to fit the schema of the end times, this dispensational theology or premillennialism. Now Gary mentioned the new Christian Zionist, which is more covenantal. Although it's not called that, there's a type of Christian Zionism in the mainline Protestant churches that really emerges out of post-Holocaust theology. And a lot of you will run into that as you deal with the churches. And some of it is, Mark Ellis critiques it as the ecumenical deal, where Christians, mostly, it's in the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, and so on. We'll say, okay, we need to have wonderful relationships with the Jewish people. So let's have a relationship where we build that kind of friendship and solidarity together, but check justice for Palestinians at the door. That's too complicated. Leave that to the Jewish community to deal with. We don't want to get into that because it will jeopardize our future and our kumbaya kind of relationship we're having. So that is a type of Christian Zionism. It's not called that, but it really is one. And the major organ of progressive, or you might even say liberal Protestant theology, the Christian century, at one time was open to theological critiques of what Israel was doing, but no more. And, Brueggemann himself is blackballed now, even though he's on the editorial board from the Christian Century, ever since he came out with that book Chosen, where he shows kind of what he believes about this. So there is that kind of, Mark Braverman also in his book, The Fatal Embrace, talks about this, where we do not go into justice for the Palestinians, leave that out, and that jeopardizes our relationship.
One thing, Don, if I can just add this one piece. I've been reading some of the chats in our chat room, and I think it's very cool how so many of you have expressed really great questions and great thoughts. But a number of you have said, this is the craziest teaching I've ever heard. This is really nuts. And I feel compelled to let you know that this is eccentric teaching. It is popular. One of you said, yeah, well, it may be marginal, but it's really popular. It is popular. It's influential out there. But if I were to gather together in a room a number of leading New Testament and Hebrew Bible theologians and say, what do you think of this kind of thing? They would just shake their heads and be embarrassed. So this is really not representative of the vast majority of Christian leaders. This is driven by laity who really don't understand theology. And it makes us really frustrated when we're theologians professionally.
Yeah. It's a populist movement, but I've got to say it is growing in South America.
Oh,
Central
absolutely.
America. It's in the black churches in a different form. It's popular in Taiwan. I think we have somebody on from Taiwan that may be concerned about this. Philippines, and you will see them coming. Nigeria, parts of Africa. You'll see many organized Christian Zionist trips coming from all over the world to Israel and seeing one side of the situation. So it's a serious problem.
I had a really funny exchange in one of my classes 2 days ago. I have a number of Korean students, Korean nationals from South Korea, and we were talking about this subject, and they said, wow, this sounds really familiar, because there was a time in Korean history where there was a Christian view that South Korea was actually the new promised land, and that South Koreans were the chosen people. And then they all laughed, all my Korean students. Well, that didn't work out very well. But then they said something fascinating. They said in the South Korean church, among conservatives, they are already hardwired to accept a teaching like this, because they, in their own national church, already had this understanding that God does use a country and an ethnicity And while it's not South Korea, we can now project this onto the modern state. It's really fascinating.
Okay.
All right, I do want to leave some time for questions here. And there were a couple in the chat that I had written down that actually you have addressed just through what you guys were just saying, which is wonderful. There was a question about how when, I believe it was from YM, about when Christian Zionists go to Israel on these trips that you were just talking about, how are they received by the Israeli government?
Right.
They are welcome with open arms. Falwell would bring a trip of 500, 700. Now Hagee does that. And they'll get the red carpet rolled out. They'll meet Netanyahu. They'll meet with military leaders. Of course, they will never meet with a Palestinian. Maybe they'll find a token Palestinian who believes this stuff. But generally, it's a one-sided, very pro-Zionist, pro-Israel trip, to build the base. And they take people in the, hundreds and hundreds in their travels. And again, it's global. There's a group called the International Christian Embassy that's Christian Zionists right in Jerusalem. When several countries were moving their embassies out of Jerusalem in the 1980s, they formed the embassy. He said, no, we will stay. And every fall, they bring, 5,000-6,000 people, and they'll march from Mount Zion down to Jerusalem. And it's all Christian Zionism. And it is such a horrific experience for the local Palestinian community. And some of them want to see the Temple Mount destroyed. And so they're part of that Temple Mount faithful thing. So it's a global phenomenon, very simplistic, but it's growing, very authoritarian, and very tribal and very nationalist. So those are some of the reasons why it's booming.
Samantha, I think that it's fair to say that no one in Israel Palestine is unaware that tourism is an enormous and important endeavor inside of the country. And also in this conflict, whoever controls the narrative in some ways can influence the outcome of this conflict. That's pretty much an open secret inside of the country. So therefore, American evangelical tourism inside of Israel is connected to this idea of shaping the narrative. And I get that, I do. There are other more progressive type groups that want to go to Israel and of course spend a lot of time in the West Bank and be with Palestinians. It's all about shaping narrative. But at least I think my evangelical friends, if some of you are online, I think that, and that's my background as well. For heaven's sakes, I was at Wheaton College for 25 years. If I was Jewish and I was in a Jewish group and I happened to be visiting, China, and I discovered there was a synagogue in Beijing, I would probably say to myself, I'd like to visit, my people there, and I'd like to worship in that synagogue and figure out, well, what's the story of your life? How did you get to Beijing and how are you doing here? What's really tragic with my evangelical friends is they will go to Israel and their passion for eschatology, for the fulfillment of prophecy, outweighs their love for other Christians who are in this land. And I think you can probably understand that. It strikes me that whenever I travel anywhere in the world, one of the things I want to do as a Christian is to find out about the welfare of other Christians who are in that place. And so here you have all of these Christians living under military occupation in a place like Bethlehem. And you actually have Christians who intentionally neglect to have contact with them. They actually will say, we will not pray with the Christians of Bethlehem because praying with them would be a political act. And I don't want to show any public support for their political interests. That just breaks my heart. And I think it breaks God's heart, that any of us would act, that narrowly whenever we are in the Middle East.
Great. I wanted to ask another question, and then I think two more is what we probably have time for. So you described the Christian Zionist theology as somewhat marginal, if not incredibly powerful and influential. But how much do you think, how much influence do you think Christian Zionist theology has on mainline Christian, call it Sunday school discourse on Israel and Palestine? You know, ideas about the Holy Land and the role that Jews, Muslims, and Christians are to play. What sort of level of influence do you think that this theology has on more mainstream Christianity?
Samantha, if I can just lead out real quick. It's rare for me to be able to find an evangelical pastor who can articulate a Christian Zionist eschatology or theology. They just haven't thought it through. But there were surveys done, they're done regularly, but I'm thinking of one from 15 years ago where you're just going to ask the average American on the street, how is the world going to end? And they may or may not go to church, it doesn't matter. The point is, this is in the air we breathe in America. How's the world going to end? There's going to be an enormous war in the Middle East. Israel is going to be backed up against the wall. America is going to come by her side, and then everything is going to fall apart and Jesus will return. Now, that's crazy. And you think, well, where did that actually come from? Those are some of the, sort of bits and pieces of an ill-formed sort of Christian Zionism. And so, I don't know, there is not a sort of a self-aware movement in the country that is promoting this theology, but it has now seeped into all kinds of people's thinking. It's remarkable how it goes. So it's so amorphous, it's very hard to confront it, it's very hard to control it, but by gum, I can be in a Presbyterian or Methodist or Episcopal church, and if I speak to this issue at the coffee hour, guaranteed somebody will come up to me and say, oh my goodness, you're not on God's side because you're not on Israel's side.
Let me just add another, that's very true. Now, a lot of the mainline churches, this is not the theology that pastors learn in seminary. In the Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopal, United Church of Christ, certainly, Catholic even. But it's in our culture, kind of, as Gary said. These themes, this narrative is there. And some people kind of fall into bits and pieces of it, but it's not systematized. So it is there. Even in some Presbyterian churches, but it's kind of a minor chord. But there is general sympathy for Israel, and it is in our hymns. It's very much in our hymns. There's certain, and I think that we need to do a study and a critique of some of our hymnology, because some of it has this end time theme. Every now and then you'll come upon a hymn that has that. But it is implicit in some ways in some of the mainline churches even. But I think there with the clergy, you get this other post-Holocaust ecumenical deal theology, where we don't want to be called anti-Semites. We want to be friends of the Jewish people and not be criticized. So therefore, we will support Israel. So that's kind of a softer version of it.
It's wrapped up with ideas about philanthropy and patriotism and
Well, that comes into, I want to say also, I want to point people to our, our last slide, which is a website, christianzionism.org, and it's a tremendous resource for people, www.christianzionism.org. And there you can get into the history, the theology, you can see Hagee again, and some books to read, a couple of Gary's books for sure. Stephen Sizer is another great writer on this. But we are just hitting some of the highlights and are not able to go deeper at this point. But go to that website. That'll take you into a little bit more study.
One of the things I feel, Samantha, if you don't mind, I feel compelled to say is, You know, we're talking again and again about Israel and its deficiencies and these kind of twisted theological political views that support Israel. But I don't want anyone who is in this webinar to misunderstand us, because, you know, inside of Israel, you will find an enormous number of good things. And so therefore, Israel is a really mixed bag. I mean, so you have some agendas in its domestic policies that are really harmful to the Palestinians. I get that. But when I do research on Israel-Palestine, I find that some of my best sources for understanding what is going on there is among Jewish scholars inside of Israel who would express the very same objections that I'm expressing or Donna's expressing. So I want to make sure that that everyone who is in this webinar understands that we're not making a wholesale judgment on the country of Israel, but we're really being very selective about some of our criticisms. Yeah, I mean, JV, Jewish Voices for Peace, is just another example in my mind of a community of Jewish leaders, scholars who are doing something that is just absolutely remarkable. And without them, I think it would be very hard for us to understand what's happening in Israel.
Yeah, amen to that.
Thank you for that caveat. And I do want to, again, I put the name of the website in the chat, christianzionism.org. I encourage folks to check that out. We're unfortunately out of time, and there were a few more questions that came in those last 10 minutes that we didn't get to. So I think my suspicion is confirmed that we're going to have to do a lot more programming on this topic. But thank you so much, Don and Gary. This has been so interesting. Really appreciate you both taking the time to be here with us. This was wonderful. And thank you.
Thank you, and thank JVP for doing this and all that tuned in. And I've seen there's probably been 100 questions we missed. So
yeah.
We may have to do it again and bring in some of our other colleagues on this.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun.
Thanks much.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night.
Okay, good night.